having me. I've been talking to a lot of you, and people seem to really love and support this organization, and it seems like a wonderful community. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Women with AIDS and the Women with AIDS Empowerment Movement, which I've had the privilege to observe from a front row seat because of some accidents of history. But I've been involved with AIDS since 1982 to present, and I want to share some of the long view with you. I was the City Hall reporter for the gay newspaper in New York City in the early 80s. At that time we were trying to get a gay rights bill passed. Right when GRID happened, gay-related immune deficiency, and that's when the government felt that what we now call AIDS was a gay-related disease. In fact, they thought it was connected to homosexuality, so that lesbians were not allowed to give blood in those early days, because they thought there was something inherent in homosexuality. It was called gay-related immune deficiency. And so, because I happened to be on the City Hall beat at that time, I covered all those early stories about AIDS, the closing of the bathhouses, a lot of the early issues. As you know, people with AIDS had no rights whatsoever, and certainly in New York, gay people had no rights. So you had a highly despised community with no rights, who were facing, a terminal illness. And yet who managed to come together and force this country to change against its will, thereby saving each other's lives. And I've been able to witness this over these past decades. Now, as I began covering it for the gay press, the straight press was not covering AIDS at all. Famously, the New York Times had been forced to cover the epidemic. But it was all but the coverage was in the gay press. Now, simultaneously with this, while I was doing that, something else was going on that I knew nothing about. A young actress from Ohio named Rebecca Cole got a job for $5 an hour working at the GRID hotline, which was sponsored by the Center for Disease Control. And this was before anyone knew anything about AIDS. They didn't know what HIV was. Nobody knew how AIDS was contracted. And so she was hired by the CDC to answer the phone and tell people that they didn't know anything. So she's working this job, and one day a woman calls her and says, there's a drug trial in my local hospital. So she started to find out about this, and it turns out that pharmaceutical companies were trying to recycle some failed cancer drugs. The most famous being AZT, which was the most highest profit-making pharmaceutical in the history of the world. But they also had alpha interferon, dextrin sulfate, Ampligen, a whole range of drugs that had failed for cancer that they were trying to recycle. And so they had these clinical trials going on. And this woman had tried to get into a clinical trial, and they told her she couldn't get in because she was a woman. Rebecca couldn't believe that this was true. And being the kind of person that she was, even though she was 24 years old, she called the CDC. And she made an appointment with them. She went down to their office and she said, you can't exclude women from experimental drug trials. And that was the first piece of activism on behalf of women with AIDS. Now, by 1987, Rebecca had become the associate director of the now AIDS hotline, and that was the year that ACT-UP was formed, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which Rebecca and I both joined in the first year, and that's how we met. So she told me this story, and there had been no coverage or mention of this at all. At this time, I had been working as a journalist all this time, and there was an editor of the Village Voice named Robert Massa who had AIDS, and who was interested, was open to the idea that there were social implications of AIDS. You had to persuade editors that there were going to be social implications of AIDS at this point. So he gave me the assignment to write the following article. This is 25 years ago, and this was the first published piece on women with AIDS. Last December, Rebecca Cole, Assistant Director of the National AIDS Hotline, got a call at home from a woman with ARC who wanted to get into a program testing the drug Ampligen. The woman had already been through 2 drug studies and proved to be a reliable participant. Like many others with ARC or AIDS, she was interested in Ampligen because it appears to be a non-toxic antiviral drug and an immune booster without the side effects of AZT. There's only one barrier between her and treatment: she is a woman. Currently, all Ampligen testing is for men only. Of 13 drug trials presently in New York City that are relevant to women, 5 are strictly for men. The trials that are open to both groups are primarily for AZT. But the most hopeful drugs for the future remain off limits to women. The hospitals and pharmaceutical companies justify the exclusion of women on the grounds that they are not reliable subjects for these trials. According to Dr. Matilda Krim, quote, clinical trials for AIDS have been so few that investigators have chosen the most controlled conditions possible. Working exclusively with gay men accomplishes this because they are homogenous in risk factors. So not true, right? Women are being excluded because of the assumption by doctors that they are IV drug users and therefore undesirable patients. Rebecca Cole, a member of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, an AIDS activist group, takes a harsher view. Quote, it's the good old boy approach to guidelines, she says. The FDA and the drug companies are not concerned with making the drugs proportionally available to the populations that need them. Ampligen was developed by Hem Research, a small company based in Nashville. Hem went into partnership with DuPont Pharmaceutical in order to get the financing necessary to bring a drug through the complicated process required for FDA approval. Hem would not open the trials to women because they had not investigated the possibilities of birth defects. DuPont was concerned about, quote, reproductive damage for which ensuing lawsuits can cost a company huge amounts of money. Now, this is interesting. Dr. Michael Grieco of St. Luke's Ampligen program cited some other reasons for women's exclusion. He says, quote, the best patients have been male homosexuals. Women have less compliance, there's less education, less motivation, and less understanding. It's different taking someone who is productive in the arts and someone living as a minority person. They're not going to have the same grasp. However, Grieco does admit that corporate sponsorship determines the accessibility of the trials to women, and it's substantially cheaper to test drugs on a specific group, such as homosexual men, than to reflect in trials the diversity of people with AIDS. As studies get funded by the government instead of by drug companies, hopefully in the future they will include women, but right now it's a question of economics. DuPont claims to be moving in this direction as well. Quote, there is a small supply of the drug, says the representative, so we can't move as quickly as we would like. But his company is planning to open a future trial at the University of Pittsburgh that will be open to women. However, there are very few women with AIDS in Pittsburgh. No plans are being made for such a project in New York City. DuPont has other arguments for male-only protocols. They claim that most researchers want an easily handleable group, and in many cases, women with AIDS are IV drug users. That leaves approximately 2,000 women nationwide who have contracted the disease without any possible experimental drug trial. Yolanda Serrano, president of ADAP, an advocacy group for IV drug users and their families, says, quote, many women with AIDS are recovered users. Many people in drug treatment programs are workers, homemakers, and mothers who have a lot of responsibility. They should have the same chance as everyone else to live out their lives, end quote. Refusing experimental drugs to women did not begin with the AIDS crisis. A 1981 report published by the American College of Physicians entitled Underrepresentation of Women in the New Drug Trials found that women have been generally ignored since the thalidomide scandal of the early 60s, where women taking the drug during pregnancy gave birth to children with missing limbs. According to the report, the results are twofold. Women who are sick cannot be treated with drugs, and in the long term, drugs are put on the market without ever having been tested on women. This can be the fatal flaw because women may have lower tolerance than men due to size, nutritional background, and hormonal fluctuations. 7 years after the AIDS crisis began, only one drug, AZT, has been approved by the FDA. AZT was never tested on women, although it is now being prescribed for them. Of course, AZT turned out to be useless. The gay community has been able to mobilize that there is now a strong network where men can get information on new drugs, but this is not available to women with AIDS who do not have the same financial and social access to health care. In 1988, women with AIDS live an average of 298 days after diagnosis. Men live 400 days. While 63% of men with AIDS are white, 72% of women with AIDS are Black or Hispanic. The Women's Committee of ACT UP intends a major campaign to open up the trials and make the drugs available in large numbers. Quote, I have not been working in AIDS every day and gone out on the streets in order to get drugs released for men only, Cole says. Okay, so that was 25 years ago. And that was the beginning of the Women with AIDS movement. Now, what I'm going to show you, so I was in ACT UP for 7 years. Let's cut way ahead to 2001. It's the 20th anniversary of AIDS. I'm driving in the car listening to NPR, and they're having some programming about the 20th anniversary of AIDS. And they say, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. I almost crashed the car. Because that's what they always do. It's, thousands of people struggle every day with every piece of energy that they have and fight to force changes, and then they do a falsely naturalize it and pretend that it just, naturally evolved because we're all so good and benevolent here in America, right? But the truth is, everything that we have is because we fought for it. It's the only way you make change in America is by fighting for it. So I called up a friend of mine, Jim Hubbard, who's a filmmaker, and we were like, we have to change this because all of our dead friends who gave all these years of their lives and died to create these changes cannot be forgotten. So we started the ACT UP Oral History Project, which you can see online at actuporalhistory.org. And since 2001, Jim and I have interviewed 120 surviving members of ACT UP New York. We've done long-form interviews that are 2 to 4 hours, and we've made it available online, and full transcripts of their interviews are available online for free. And 80,000 people have downloaded these transcripts. And we've checked to see who these people were. Many of them were from Eastern Europe and Asia. So we think it's people with AIDS in countries that don't have AIDS activist movements. But what's really interesting about reading these transcripts and watching these videos is that you realize that these are just regular people. These are people who were bookkeepers, who worked in furniture stores, who did all kinds of things, who changed the world. And that regular people can change the world. And what they talk about in these interviews is how they did it, what their strategies were. And it's really exciting because after all, the AIDS activist movement was the most recent successful social movement in American history. Okay, so we started doing all these interviews, and then people would say, I have this film in here, I don't know what to do with it. Or I have this video. Or my friend died and I have all this stuff, and in that box is some Super 8 film. Would you take it? So we started collecting all this footage. Now, camcorders were invented in the middle of ACT UP. So the video revolution and becoming a video activist was made possible right as ACT UP was happening, at its height. But we got stuff that was shot in Super 8 film, 16mm film, high 8 video. There was no way to record anything off a television set, so people were aiming their cameras at the TV and recording it. We just got all this footage. We collected 2,000 hours of archival footage from this era. So Jim digitized all this footage. And what I'm going to show you now is a 16-minute clip that he made, bringing together archival footage and the interviews that we did. And this is about the Women with AIDS Empowerment Movement. And let me just tell you a little bit about what you're going to see. ACT UP did succeed in forcing the FDA to approve drugs on a fast track. We did it by literally taking over the building of the FDA. So that changed. Drug trials were forced to include women, so that changed. But then we realized that something significant had not changed, and that was that the CDC had an official definition of what AIDS was that you had to meet in order to get benefits. And none of the things that only women get when they have AIDS were on the list. So people were finding that women were dying of AIDS without ever getting diagnosis and therefore never able to get benefits or to get studied. So ACT UP began a 4-year campaign to force the CDC to change the definition of AIDS so that women with AIDS could get benefits and get studied. And that's what this clip is about. And what you're going to see are the very first leaders in the Women with AIDS self-empowerment movement. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. Who went on the street. And remember, this is before any agencies. This is before any federal money for AIDS. This is when the entire AIDS movement was on the street and was propelled by our own constituency forcing change in an activist way. And we can never forget that that's where this came from, because that's how you get change. When we get too complicit, we have to remember that bureaucracies do not produce change. Activism